80 years. That's how long the United Nations has stood as a symbol of humanity's highest hopes. 8 decades of speeches, treaties, and declarations promising peace, dignity, and equality for all peoples. And yet when the hall of the General Assembly filled once more for its 80th session, the air was not one of triumph, but of unease. For on this anniversary, instead of celebration, a voice rose from West Africa, a voice that refused to play along with the pageantry. Standing before the marble walls of the UN, the representative of President Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso did not deliver polite words of commemoration. He spoke with fire. He spoke of failure. He declared that what should have been a milestone of progress was in fact a collective disappointment, 8 decades of broken promises, 8 decades of shattered dreams. He asked the question that hung like thunder over the chamber. How can Africa, cradle of humanity and home to more than 1 billion souls, still remain voiceless in the highest council of the world? The contrast could not have been sharper. Billions of dollars spent on peacekeeping operations, yet nations like Burkina Faso were left with nothing but frustration, insecurity, and suffering. 80 years of multilateralism, and still the fate of Africa was decided elsewhere in secret rooms, dominated by the permanent powers of the Security Council. This was no ordinary speech. It was an indictment and a call to awakening. A warning that the UN now stands at the same precipice where the League of Nations once collapsed. And a reminder that people who have suffered for generations will not remain silent forever. So we must ask ourselves, is the world ready to listen? Or will we watch history repeat itself as injustice corrodes the very institutions meant to prevent it? If you believe the truth is more important than the headlines, stay with us. And if you want to be among the first to support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for Africa, please share this message and subscribe. When the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly opened its doors, the world expected ceremony. 80 years since the founding of the UN, diplomats prepared their talking points, the press filled their notebooks, and many imagined a day of proud reflection. But for Burkina Faso, represented by the voice of President Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this was not a moment for hollow celebration, it was a reckoning. The speech began with courtesy as tradition dictates. Greetings to the President of the Assembly, gratitude to the outgoing chair, acknowledgement of the Secretary General. These were words any diplomat could have uttered. But almost immediately the tone shifted. The pleasantries gave way to a piercing truth. The United Nations, born in 1945 to safeguard peace, had become instead a symbol of disillusion. This anniversary, the representative said, is not a triumph. It is a fiasco. 8 decades, he reminded the hall, had been spent on promises unfulfilled. 8 decades of optimism sorely tested. 8 decades of disappointment. 8 decades of shattered dreams. The repetition was deliberate, like a drumbeat, hammering into the conscience of the world that nothing had changed for those at the margins. The audience shifted uneasily. This was not the music of diplomacy, but the cry of a continent. Then came the central accusation, one that could not be ignored. How could it be that Africa, cradle of humanity, home to more than 1 billion people, remained excluded from the decision-making of the Security Council? This was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a wound laid bare. In the eyes of Burkina Faso, the UN had preserved an architecture of injustice where 5 permanent powers could veto the future of entire civilizations, while Africa itself remained silenced. The indictment grew sharper still when the failures of peacekeeping were laid out. Billions of dollars had been poured into missions across the Sahel and beyond. Yet what was left behind? Not peace, but bitterness. Not stability, but broken communities. The representative of Burkina Faso did not mince words. These missions were leaving nations in the lurch, producing frustration rather than tangible results. It was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the system. The General Assembly, he argued, passed resolutions that were non-binding and therefore inaudible and ineffective. The Security Council, meanwhile, was described as tarnished by politicization, powerless due to its divisions, and at times a troublemaker because its permanent members themselves were the very actors fueling the world's conflicts. And in this moment, the speech ceased to be just an African complaint, it became a universal charge. The UN, they said, was becoming like the League of Nations before it, a hollow institution on the verge of collapse. The image was stark, reminding every delegate that history has already recorded what happens when international bodies fail to reform. But amidst the anger, there was clarity. The representative of Burkina Faso was not simply condemning, he was demanding change. He pointed to the glaring double standards, peacekeeping for some, silence for others, resolutions passed yet ignored, billions spent while children in Burkina Faso walked miles without schools or clinics. These were not abstract grievances. They were the daily realities of a nation under siege by terrorism, abandoned by those who claimed to be allies. This was the event at its core. A country that has suffered for more than a decade stood before the world to declare the obvious. That the UN in its current form had failed. That Africa could not wait another 80 years to be acknowledged. And that Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership would no longer measure its dignity by the applause of international halls but by the strength of its own people. This moment mattered because it pierced the silence. It turned a stage built for diplomacy into a tribunal where the accused was the very institution hosting the session. And while some may have dismissed the words as rhetoric, the resonance was undeniable. For if one small landlocked nation could stand up and speak this truth, what would happen if an entire continent found its voice? The answer to that question remains uncertain. But on that day in that hall, history recorded the moment when Burkina Faso declared the UN's 80th anniversary not a celebration of peace, but an alarm bell for justice. If the first act of Burkina Faso's address was an indictment of history, the second was a confrontation with the present. The General Assembly, already unsettled, leaned closer as the representatives' tone hardened. What had begun as a solemn reflection now surged into outrage. The target was unmistakable: the United Nations Security Council. Once imagined as the guardian of peace, it was instead painted as the architect of injustice. The words struck like blows tarnished by politicization, powerless as a result of its divisions, pernicious in its complicity. No diplomat could mistake the meaning. The very powers meant to arbitrate global peace were accused of financing chaos. The speech spared no one. Permanent members of the council were called out as both judges and criminal states that not only dominated the agenda but also fueled the very conflicts they pretended to resolve. Delegates shifted uneasily in their seats. This was no longer critique, it was accusation delivered under the eyes of the world. Then the spotlight narrowed. For years, African leaders had spoken in abstractions, careful not to name names. But Burkina Faso broke that silence. A case in point is France. The representative thundered. The Macron regime's public media has become the mouthpiece of the criminals who commit cowardly, barbaric attacks against our peaceable citizens. The hall froze. Rarely does a nation accuse another so directly inside these chambers. The effect was electric. For decades, French peacekeepers and French companies had walked African soil under the banner of assistance. Now, before the world, they were unmasked as predators. To older delegates, it recalled the fiery voice of Thomas Sankara in 1984 when he declared Africa must break free from neo-colonial chains. The lineage was clear. Ibrahim Traoré was carrying that same torch. But this was more than rhetoric. Burkina Faso came armed with facts. Since 2023, the Patriotic Support Fund had raised 413 billion CFA francs, not from foreign donors, but from its own citizens and diaspora. 72% of its territory had been reclaimed from armed groups. Schools were reopening, displaced families were returning, and a nation once fractured was stitching itself back together. We decided to take our destiny in our own hands, the representative proclaimed. That declaration hit like a thunderclap. For decades, African security had been outsourced to international missions with little accountability. Here was a small nation saying it no longer needed guardians who arrived with billions in budgets but left behind ruins. Instead, it relied on volunteers, on soldiers, on martyrs whose names would never appear in UN reports but whose sacrifices kept villages alive. And with that came the counterstrike. The representative rejected outright the UN's own report on children and armed conflict in Burkina Faso, calling it peppered with counter-truths and semantic manipulation. To many, this was defiance bordering on audacity. But to Burkina Faso, it was survival. Reports drafted in New York or Geneva could not erase the reality of mothers burying their sons or classrooms turned into shelters. The climax rose higher still. Terrorism, they declared, was not some spontaneous threat. It was a weapon the troops of predatory foreign armies, armed and financed by powers seeking to plunder Africa's resources. This was a claim rarely uttered so bluntly in such a forum. The implication was unmistakable. What the world called counterterrorism was in fact a cover for a new imperialism. Yet Burkina Faso did not stand alone. From this fury was born solidarity. Alongside Mali and Niger, the country had forged the Confederation of Sahel States ASS, a new alliance to defend sovereignty and shape their own destiny. This is not retreat, the representative clarified. It is dignity. It is our refusal to be pawns in someone else's game. The names of Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah were invoked, their legacies woven into the living struggle of today, and the response, the chamber was silent. Some delegates whispered, others stared straight ahead, but everyone understood what had just happened. A nation once dismissed as small and landlocked had stood before the most powerful institution in the world and declared, "We will no longer ask permission to be free." The crescendo closed with a warning that echoed beyond the hall. If the Security Council continued to deny reform, if it remained deaf to the demands of Africa, it would not survive. Just as the League of Nations collapsed under the weight of irrelevance, so too could the UN. It was not a threat. It was history speaking through the voice of Burkina Faso. The weight of Burkina Faso's words did not rest only on accusations against the United Nations or France. What gave the speech its undeniable force was the evidence it carried, the living results of a people who refused to collapse. For once, a small African nation did not come to the UN asking for aid or pity. It came with proof. Since 2023, the Patriotic Support Fund had collected more than 413 billion CFA francs. Not from international lenders or development banks, but from ordinary citizens, from volunteers who gave what little they had from the diaspora who sent money home in defiance of despair. The representative held this up not as a statistic but as a symbol, a nation funding its own freedom. Every franc was a declaration that the sovereignty of Burkina Faso was not for sale. The results, he insisted, were tangible. Over 72% of the country's territory, once lost to armed groups, had been brought back under national control. Roads that had been closed by checkpoints were reopening. Farmers were returning to their land. Displaced families, once huddled in makeshift camps, were walking home with dignity. Even schools silenced for years by gunfire and fear were reopening their doors. Teachers, children, and parents were reclaiming the rhythm of daily life. For a global audience accustomed to viewing Burkina Faso through the lens of crisis reports, these words were startling. Here was a story of resilience rather than victimhood. A government battered by terrorism and international pressure was nevertheless rebuilding with the hands of its own people. But beyond the statistics lay the human cost. The representative paused to honor the martyrs, both civilian and military, who had fallen in defense of the homeland. Their sacrifice, he said, was the price of sovereignty, and in that hall the names of the dead became more powerful than the speeches of diplomats. These domestic victories carried immense political meaning. They showed that a government once dismissed as transitional and unstable could deliver results where billion-dollar missions had failed. The Patriot Support Fund and the Faso Mebo initiative, launched in 2023, were not just programs, they were acts of defiance against dependency. They declared that Burkina Faso would chart its own course, however difficult, rather than live forever under foreign dictates. That defiance extended even to the United Nations itself. When the UN released its report on children and armed conflict in Burkina Faso, accusing the government of abuses, the representative fired back. He called the report peppered with counter-truths and condemned its very title as semantic manipulation. To many in the chamber, this was shocking. But for Burkina Faso, it was survival. Accepting such narratives, he warned, would erase the sacrifices of ordinary people and justify further interference. Politically, this confrontation revealed a deeper transformation. Burkina Faso was no longer content to play the role of subordinate state, grateful for whatever crumbs of aid arrived. It was demanding recognition as a sovereign, equal one whose successes and failures must be judged on its own terms. By mobilizing its own population and rejecting externally imposed stories, the country was rewriting its political identity before the eyes of the world. The broader consequences for the region were clear. If one nation could mobilize its people to finance security and reclaim its land, what stopped others from following suit? The model of dependency aid in exchange for influence, peacekeepers in exchange for silence, was being challenged at its core. The Sahel was showing that sovereignty was not just a slogan, but a practice built from the ground up. And for citizens at home, the results were more than political. They were personal. A child walking back into a classroom, a farmer planting again in a field, once abandoned, a widow receiving recognition for her husband's sacrifice. These were the daily victories that proved the speeches were not empty. In this way, the domestic consequences of Burkina Faso's defiance became inseparable from its political message. Sovereignty was not an abstract ideal. It was bread on the table, children in school, families returning home. And it was this lived reality that made the country's voice at the UN impossible to ignore. The echoes of Burkina Faso's words did not stop at the walls of the UN chamber. They rippled outward, forcing the world to confront uncomfortable questions. For if a landlocked nation in West Africa could openly defy the Security Council, what would stop an entire continent from demanding the same? At the heart of the speech was a call for bold reform. Africa must finally claim a permanent seat on the Security Council. To deny over 1 billion people a voice in global decision-making, the representative argued, was not only unjust but dangerous. The UN could not survive as a body that silenced the cradle of humanity. In this demand, Burkina Faso was not alone. Leaders across Africa had long pressed for reform, but on this day, the voice came with unusual urgency, carrying the weight of real sacrifices made at home. The address also connected Africa's struggle with global currents. Burkina Faso declared solidarity with Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Russia, nations described as victims of economic sanctions and political isolation. By aligning itself with these states, the message was clear: Africa would not be coerced into silence by embargoes or ultimatums. Sovereignty, whether in Latin America or the Sahel, was a right, not a privilege granted by stronger nations. For the United States, though not mentioned by name, the implications were unmistakable. Washington has long relied on the UN framework to legitimize its global agenda. Yet here was a member state exposing the system as bias-dominated and unfit for purpose. The representative's words functioned as a mirror, reflecting back the image of a world where American and Allied influence often meant stalled reforms, endless conflicts, and selective justice. Europe, too, was not spared. France was singled out with unprecedented bluntness. Once the self-proclaimed guardian of the Sahel, it now stood accused of enabling terrorism and exploiting resources. This charge resonated across the global South, where memories of colonialism remain vivid and where French influence is increasingly viewed with suspicion. But beyond the accusations lay an alternative vision. The formation of the Confederation of Sahel States, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, was presented not as retreat but as renaissance. A regional alliance built on dignity, sovereignty, and cooperation, it was described as the heir to the dreams of Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah. In other words, the Sahel was no longer waiting for the West to deliver security or development. It was building its own future. To the world, this was a warning wrapped in hope. The message was simple: reform. The United Nations respect the sovereignty of nations and embrace a multipolar order, or risk watching the very institution meant to preserve peace crumble into irrelevance. 80 years after the signing of the UN Charter, Burkina Faso's voice rang like a verdict: the system has failed. What was meant to be a guardian of peace has too often become an instrument of domination, a council of powers protecting their interests rather than humanity's future. And just as the League of Nations once collapsed into irrelevance, the United Nations now faces the same fate if it refuses reform. The warning is not abstract. It is written in the daily lives of people who have endured wars labeled as peacekeeping sanctions, justified as humanitarian, and terrorism fueled by the very actors claiming to fight it. It is carved into the graves of martyrs who gave their lives not for foreign approval, but for their homeland's dignity. Burkina Faso's message was simple, yet profound: sovereignty is not negotiable. But there was also hope. The rebirth of the Sahel through the Confederation of States, the mobilization of citizens through the Patriotic Fund, the reopening of schools and homes, all these showed what becomes possible when nations refuse to bow. This was not only Burkina Faso's story, it was Africa's, and in truth it belongs to the world. So the question now passes to us: will we demand a global order built on justice and equality, or will we remain silent as the structures of power decay before our eyes? If you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's call for reform speaks not just for Africa, but for humanity, then add your voice. Please share this message if you feel you are among the first to stand with him, and subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because history does not wait, and neither should we.